Valued listeners, thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about the Euthyphro Dilemma and the nature of goodness. This is honestly a very fascinating topic, even though the Euthyphro Dilemma is not something that you hear every day. It allows us to talk about the nature of goodness and what that means. This allows us to learn a lot of very useful theology that comes to us from this guy, Saint Gregory Palamas, who was a Byzantine Greek theologian, originally from Constantinople, though he eventually became the Bishop of Thessaloniki, and is a huge hard hitter in the world of Orthodox theology. What's also really great about him is that he focuses entirely on the earlier fathers that came before him. He draws heavily from them, and you'll be seeing that today. This is really good for all of us, because anyone who knows Orthodoxy knows that we don't like people innovating beyond what they should, and so we should keep it to the very basics. Now, a little preface here. I am not a theologian. I have never attended a seminary or anything like that. And so I'm just approaching this as somebody who's a fan of philosophical debates and arguments. So I might be getting a little bit of this wrong. Certainly I don't have the depth of somebody who is a theologian. And if you want orthodox opinions, never listen to me. Just go and read these guys yourselves and talk to somebody who is qualified. Go to your local Orthodox church. That's the most important thing that anybody can do. So as we get into the Euthyphro Dilemma, it's noteworthy to say that the bulk of what I'm drawing for on this is all coming from one web page here. It is the Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry. This is a very old website. It was around when I was first searching the internet over 20 years ago. It's really a fantastic place with lots of articles on apologetics. I think it was honestly one of the first places on the internet where you had all these compilations of Christian apologetic arguments. So definitely lots of credit to this website. Do check it out if you are into apologetics. You will not be disappointed. All right. Without further ado, let's get into the dilemma itself. The Euthyphro Dilemma comes from Plato's Euthyphro Dialogue, and it's had many different forms over the centuries. Basically, it's: are moral acts willed by God because they are good, or are they good because they are willed by God? Another way of saying it: does God say that things are moral because they are by nature moral, or do they become moral because God decides them to be? The dilemma is that if these acts are morally good because they are good by nature, then they are independent of God, and morality somehow exists apart from God. These acts would already be good in themselves, and God is actually appealing to them to find out what is good. Hardly something that is omnipotent there. On the other hand, if something is good because God commands that it is good, then goodness itself is arbitrary. God could have called murder good and honesty not good. This means that God is something like a tyrant, and what he declares to be good is entirely arbitrary. Now, how do we answer the dilemma? It's actually a pretty easy answer, very anticlimactic. The Euthyphro Dilemma is diffused by simply pointing out that this is actually a false dichotomy, meaning that it's saying there's only two options to answer this question, neither of which are very good. However, there actually is a third option, and that is that goodness is based on God's nature. And ding, 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 that is the absolutely correct answer. To get into why that is the case, we're going to appeal to the example of lying. How do we discover that lying is bad? Well, we are, my friends, going to jump over to Titus 1:2, which states, "In hope of eternal life, which God, that cannot lie, promised before the world began, ... So, in this brief passage, it does state, God cannot lie, very bluntly. Thus, God cannot lie. Telling the truth is part of God's nature, and so we know that lying is morally wrong. God appeals to his own nature to prove to us that lying is wrong. A very nifty example of how this can be employed. But I'm sure that many people are actually thinking that this is a very, very too convenient excuse, right? You always get suspicious when something seems too convenient, and that third option you didn't think of just happens to be there within grasp. And so as it says here, so if Carm talks about goodness as something revealed from God's nature, can we actually find proof of this in Christianity itself? Is this something that Christians have always been saying, or is this something that Christian apologetics just snuck into the argument later? Well, the answer is actually that this is a very old argument, and it's not something even that St. Gregory Palamas synthesized in the 14th century. It's something that comes to us from long before that. So we actually find plenty of proof in Orthodox theology that goodness is co-eternal with God and is one of the divine energies that emanates from him. It's not simply some set of principles that are abstract from God, and they're not discovered or invented. These are quintessential parts of God himself. So, let's go over some quotations. Now, all of these quotations, they come from the Topics of Natural and Theological Science and on the Moral and Aesthetic Life, 150 texts. And the last quotes here come from the Declaration of the Holy Mountain in the Defense of Those Who Devoutly Practice a Life of Stillness. Both of these texts are found in volume 4 of the Philokalia. So go out and get a copy of this. It's available for free on the internet if you want to work with these texts directly or verify that I'm pulling them from a legitimate source. I highly recommend the Philokalia to people to read. However, here's the thing. If you're an Orthodox Christian, you should consult your spiritual father before reading it, since a lot of these texts are directed at those who practice the monastic life. So it could be something that your spiritual father doesn't feel is correct for you. But nonetheless, go out and find these texts in other places. Go find some St. Gregory Palamas if it's not recommended to you, because it's very valuable material. All right, so let's get into it. First, we're going to read some texts that prove the divine energies emanate from God and they're dependent on God. First quote, "The divine supra-essentiality is never named in the plural, but the divine and uncreated grace and energy of God is indivisibly divided, like the sun's rays that warm, illumine, quicken, and bring increase as they cast their radiance upon what they enlighten, and shine on the eyes of whoever beholds them. In the manner, then, of this faint likeness, the divine energy of God is called not only one, but also multiple by the theologians. Thus, St. Basil the Great declares, 'What are the energies of the Spirit? Their greatness cannot be told, and they are numberless. How can we comprehend what precedes the ages? What were God's energies before the creation of noetic reality? For prior to the creation of noetic reality and beyond the ages, for the ages are also noetic creations, no one has ever spoken or conceived of anything created. Therefore, The powers and energies of the divine spirit, even though they are said in theology to be multiple, are uncreated and are to be indivisibly distinguished from the single and wholly undivided essence of the Spirit. The theologians affirm that the uncreated energy of God is indivisibly divided and multiple, as St. Basil the Great has explained above. And since the divine and deifying illumination and grace is not the essence but the energy of God, for this reason it comes forth from God, not only in the singular but in multiplicity as well. It is bestowed proportionally on those who participate in it, and corresponding to the capacity of those who receive it. The deifying resplendence enters them to a greater or lesser degree. Now, one interesting thing to pull from this quotation that doesn't necessarily have to do with what we're going to talk about today is this line here. For the ages are also noetic creations. Basically, right here, it's saying that time itself is a noetic creation. It is something that is created by God's mind. So, when you think about time again in the future, don't think of it as having any reality beyond that which is dependent on God, much like goodness itself. Not a topic we're going to discuss today, but this is a really interesting little piece of theology we can take from the above text and that you can put in your rucksack as you move down the theological battlefield. Next quote. And Isaiah himself, the clarion voice of the prophets, not only distinguished them plainly from the divine essence by their number, but also indicated the uncreated nature of these divine energies by the words, rest upon him. You gotta love how he describes Isaiah, the clarion voice of the prophets. Oof, what a title. But here, of course, the operative word here is rest upon him. This phrase indicating that divine energies do indeed rest upon God. If they rest upon him, they are essentially something that is coming off of God. They are emanations of God, as it clearly states here in the Bible, as he refers to Isaiah. Quote number 3. And St. Basil, inspired by the Spirit of God, said, not that the energies of the Spirit came into being, but that they existed prior to the creation of noetic reality and beyond the ages. Only God is operative and all-powerful from eternity, and therefore he possesses pre-eternal operations and powers. Now we have St. Basil showing to us that the energies of the Spirit, they came into being, not in any sense, but that they existed prior to the creation of noetic reality. So they are beyond time itself, beyond the ages. And God is the operative and all-powerful force who possesses them. On to the fourth section here. Excuse me, the fourth quotation, which is in the second section. And here we're going to see that this divine energy fills all things in the universe, and through it all things operate. Because both the divine essence and the divine energy are everywhere inseparably present, God's energy is accessible also to us creatures. For, according to the theologians, it is indivisibly divided, whereas the divine nature, they say, remains totally undivided. Thus, St. John Chrysostom says, a drop of grace filled all things with knowledge. Through it, miracles were wrought in sins forgiven. Here you can kind of see a little bit of that tasty panentheism. We're talking about how some aspect of God is filling up the entire universe. God's energy is accessible to all of us creatures. It is everywhere in creation and is inseparably present. Of course, the universe is not made up of God himself. Rather, this is God's energy permeates the universe. Very nice. Next section, third section here. However, we actually can never be part of the essence of God, and can only become illuminated by God's divine energies. This is an incredibly important distinction for anybody who is an Orthodox Christian and wants to understand the concept of theosis, which we'll get into a bit later here. But let's just jump into quotation numero ocho. That's not 5. Numero cinco. I don't speak Spanish. According to St. Maximus, Moses and David and whoever else became vessels of divine energy by laying aside the properties of then fallen nature, were inspired by the power of God, and they became living icons of Christ, being the same as he is by grace rather than by assimilation. He further says, the purity in Christ and in the saints is one. So St. Maximus is saying that these great figures in the Bible, Moses and King David, they became vessels of divine energy. They did not become part of God's essence. Rather, they became vessels which are filled with divine energy, which is an extremely important word here. And so, through grace, they become assimilated into God's energy. And this is what happens with all saints. This is basically what theosis is, ladies and gents. We will cover theosis again a little bit later. Let's keep moving into the next section and into the 6th quotation. Our knowledge of goodness is also fully dependent on God, and so is our basic nature. Wow. All right. So the divine intellects move in a circular fashion, uniting themselves with the unoriginate and unending illuminations of the beautiful and good. For God himself, and not else, is light for eternal beings. What the sun is for sensory beings, God is for noetic beings. Now, this is extremely dense here. The divine intellects. This is talking about divine energies here. A divine intellect is energy which is an intellection. You can know this from the context of the original passage. I am not lying to you here. And what's also interesting is saying move in a circular fashion. What is meant by this? From the context as well, you learned that the circular fashion he's talking about is a reflective fashion. It's something that circles back in on itself. Circle here actually represents the concept of looking all around, especially looking back and into the self. All right? And it says here that they are united with unoriginate and unending illuminations of the beautiful and the good. So the good is unending and unoriginate. That is to say, this is something that has existed eternally and is co-eternal with God. Wow. So right here we see that goodness is eternal. It's something that goes right back to God. It is a part of who he is. And what does it say? The last part here, isn't this poetic? What the sun is for sensory beings, God is for noetic beings. That is to say, we can only understand the reality of spirit, the reality of soul, the reality of intellection with God. Just as you're only to distinguish anything outside of you with your vision, if there is light, if there is a sun, so it is the case that if you do not have God, you will not be able to distinguish anything that is good or even evil in the noetic world. And so we are dependent on God to have any kind of moral compass, because this beauty and goodness, which are tied together here, very interesting to see, ladies and gents, the beautiful and the good are tied together. They are unending, unoriginate, and co-eternal with God himself. Next section. In addition to this, we become closer to participating in God through participating in divine intellects, in divine virtue, in goodness. Quote, every created nature is far removed from and completely foreign to the divine nature. For if God is nature, other things are not nature. But if every other thing is nature, he is not a nature, just as he is not a being if all other things are beings. And if he is a being, then all other things are not beings. And if you accept this as true, also for wisdom, goodness, and in general all things that pertain to God or are ascribed to him, then your theology will be correct and in accordance with the saints. God both is and is said to be the nature of all beings, insofar as all partake of him, and subside by means of his participation, not, however, by participation in his nature, far from it, but by participation in his energy. In this sense, he is the being of all beings, the form that is in all forms, as the author of form, the wisdom of the wise, and simply the all of all things. Moreover, he is not nature because he transcends every nature. He is not being because he transcends every being. And he is not, nor does he possess a form because he transcends form. How then can we draw near to God? By drawing near to his nature. But not a single creating being has or can have any communication with or proximity to the sublime nature. Thus, if anyone is drawn too close to God, he has evidently approached him by means of his energy. In what way? By natural participation in that energy. But this is common to all created things. It is not, therefore, by virtue of natural qualities, but by virtue of what one achieves through free choice, that one is close to or distant from God. But free choice pertains only to things endowed with intelligence. So among all creatures, only those endowed with intelligence can be far from or close to God, drawing close to him through virtue, becoming distant through vice. Thus, such beings alone are capable of wretchedness or blessedness. Let us strive to lay hold of blessedness. That's really a monster quotation there that provides us so much rich theology, commenting on who is capable of being close or far to God, and also on really the metaphysics of God himself, God as a completely transcendent being upon which all are dependent, and also somebody that really defies our concepts. This will be further clarified later. But before we go on, two notes. The first one about this. Please note that what they're saying here, what Saint Gregory Palamas is saying here, is that those endowed with intelligence can be far or close to God through virtue or vice. So it's our actions that bring us close to the divine energies or drive us away from them. The more virtuous you are, the closer you are to the goodness and the divine energies of God. Very important. The second thing I want to say is you've probably noticed by now that the punctuation in my quotations are a bit off. If you're just listening to this, you may have not noticed. You may have just heard that I kind of am punctuating things a little bit strangely with my voice, and I apologize for that. This is just how the Kindle book copied over when I was dragging the quotations. On to the next section. This gets us closer to the concept of virtue and goodness. So we've not actually been able to answer so far what goodness is simply. And there's this great mystery that continues. So, what is goodness? Shortly after the above passage, and skipping through only a paragraph that talks just about, proximity to God, natural inclination, and noetic sensing, we're left with this very important excerpt. The inspired and universal tongue of the divine theologians, St. John of Damascus, says in the second of his theological chapters, A man who would speak or hear anything about God should know with all clarity that in what concerns theology and the divine economy, not all things are inexpressible, and not all are capable of expression. And neither are all things unknowable, nor are they all knowable. We know that those divine realities of which we desire to speak transcend speech, since such realities exist according to a principle that is transcendent. They are not outside the realm of speech by reason of some deficiency, but are beyond the conceptual power innate within us, and to which we give utterance when speaking to others. For neither can our speech explain these realities by interpretation, nor does our innate conceptual power have the capacity to attain them of its own accord through investigation. Thus, we should not permit ourselves to say anything concerning God, but rather we should have our recourse to those who in the Spirit speak of the things of the Spirit, and this is the case even when our adversaries require some statement from us. Bam! This is one of the most important things you'll ever read about theology. And here it is it's basically an admission that the divine realities are inexpressible and they're not capable of expression. And all things, not all things, are knowable, right? So all things can be unknowable, and I just got lost there. So a huge portion of things can be thought of as unknowable. So divine realities are something that transcends speech. Human speech is not going to be able to express what goodness is in its basic form. And so we should not be waiting it. This seems like a cop-out answer, but surely if you can accept anything, you can accept the limitations of mankind, right? Just as how we don't have brains good enough to conceive of all of the natural principles or laws. And even if we did, you can only imagine this happening through something like artificial intelligence. But then the human mind isn't going to be able to hold all of the things that artificial intelligence could hold. Now imagine God here. If we had access to all that is goodness and we were able to have a brain like God, right, which we absolutely do not, we would need to then be able to have this omniscience in order to have a full concept of what actually is goodness. And if we're omniscient, will the English language or any human language be adequate for expressing these concepts? Of course not. So please, ladies and gents, this isn't asking very much. Accept the limitations of human language and the human mind. We already accept that for this and so many other things. Next section. Goodness is something that has to remain undefined, and in place of goodness emanating from God, St. Gregory Palamas invokes St. Dionysius, the Areopagite, speaking of beneficial processions. Eventually, he distinguished these as essence-forming logoi, or the inner principles of existent things, which unitedly pre-exist in God. This is very tasty. We're getting close to the end, folks. What does it leave us with? What are we now stumbling upon? Here we go. Quote, for the energy that creates individual essence, life and wisdom, and in general makes and sustains created beings, is identical with the divine volitions and the divine participle principles, that the gifts of the supernal goodness, the cause of all. Whoa. We are talking about divine will and participle principles, which are gifts of supernal goodness. Let's keep pushing. We're not there yet. So, maybe goodness is something that we can conceive as an energy from divine volition, participle principles, and it's manifested in an essence-forming logoi. Here, essence can be thought of as nature, so you can think of it as a nature-forming logoi. These are, of course, rooted in the divine energies of supernal goodness. Now, think about this. A nature-forming logoi, a nature-forming logos, multiple, plural. That's going to be something that is interacting with the whole universe around us and is inside of us, right? Right? So let's keep going. We're going to have to summarize this now, and this is where it really starts to get good. St. Maximus, who says, and I'm quoting, all immortal things and immortality itself, all living things and all life itself, all holy things and holiness itself, all good things and goodness itself, all blessings and blessedness itself, all beings and being itself are manifestly works of God. Some began to be in time, for they have not always existed. Others did not begin to be in time, for goodness, blessedness, holiness, and immortality have always existed. And again, he says, goodness and all that is good. Goodness and all that is included in the principle of goodness. And to be brief, all life, immortality, simplicity, immutability, and infinity, and all other qualities that contemplative vision perceives as substantively appertaining to God are realities of God, which do not begin to be in time, for non-existence is never prior to goodness, nor to any of the other things we have listed, even if those things which participate in them do in themselves have a beginning in time. All goodness is without beginning, because there is no time prior to God. God is eternally and the unique author of its being, and God is infinitely above all beings, whether participants or participable. So goodness abstracted into something independent from God, like a certain set of ideas or principles, is completely an error according to these quotations. Rather, goodness is an energy that is co-eternal with God. And I believe that it's necessary that this goodness is to be understood as a metaphysical energy that emanates from God as a divine essence. It's not a literal energy like light, but this is where it gets fun. However, its behavior in the supernatural world, that is to say the world above us, is itself compared to light. So we're going to talk about how St. Gregory Palamas talks about the Transfiguration at Mount Tabor. God did not change his nature suddenly to blind the apostles in this transfiguration. Rather, the apostles became party to it, to actually be able to see it for the first time. It became something that they could see the true nature of God. And it was so bright, it caused them to fall down. It's something that can never actually be gazed upon directly. Let's just get right into this quotation before I butcher anything more. Thus, Christ was transfigured, not by the addition of something he was not, nor by a transformation into something he was not, but by the manifestation to his disciples of what he really was. He opened their eyes so that instead of being blind, they could see, while he himself remained the same. They could now see him as other than he had appeared to them formerly, for he is the true light, John 1:9, the beauty of divine glory, and he shone forth like the sun through this image, though this image is imperfect, since what is uncreated cannot be imaged in creation without some diminution. There he is. He's saying that he cannot even tell people, he cannot even express God's vision to us properly because of our finiteness, our inability to be like God. So goodness behaves in the same way as light in this case. It's like a divine energy that's always present and indivisible. So how we have to understand this is that when Christ was on earth, this glory, this amazing glory, this connection to divine energy, this is divine essence that is emanating divine energy, it was never not this extraordinarily bright thing that we could not gaze upon. It's just that simply the apostles were only given the power to gaze upon this divine energy. So this is why it's so exciting. The whole universe is constantly full of this divine energy that we cannot see. It permeates all things. Just as the previous quotations say, we are actually a party to divine energy right now. This is why the hesychasts, the people who practice this particular Orthodox form of prayer, the saying of the publican's prayer, the Jesus prayer, they are able to see the uncreated light. The uncreated light is the divine energy of God. It is goodness itself. That is the nature of goodness that we get to at the very bottom. Very exciting. It's interesting that just trying to discuss the Euthyphro Dilemma, we're able to get into the nature of goodness, which brings us to such theologically rich writings from St. Gregory Palamas. Now, again, before I go, I gotta really emphasize this part right here. This is how I believe the Christian metaphysics works. I'm not a theologian. So, this is just a stab at it. All I'm really doing here is reading quotes. I'm not here trying to innovate on anything. I'm just trying to stitch it together a little bit and condense it down so people can have a quick go here at what St. Gregory Palamas was saying. So I really hope that you find that illuminating and interesting. And the next time that you have to discuss the nature of goodness, maybe you'll think about St. Gregory Palamas' words, and you'll think about how the universe is filled with a divine energy that emanates from the divine nature of God, and it is accessible to all of us through devotion and prayer. And you'll also remember that goodness is something that we cannot actually define. It is totally above us. It is incapable for human speech to define it, but we can know that it originates in God. And so you also have to tell people that goodness can never be thought of as some set of abstract principles independent from God. That is not an option. God does not appeal to these things. And so the goodness itself is co-eternal with God. It's a part of God, and it emanates from Him. It's a divine energy filling everything. Now, there's a lot of other interesting questions that can come up from this. For instance, now that we've defined here what goodness is, what's the nature of evil? What's the nature of some of these other things? Well, those are all very difficult ones. I will try to get back to you if I ever stumble across any juicy material that deals with this. But all I can say is thank you very much if you made it to the end of the video. My commentary is completely inadequate for this. It's very exciting material. I will just say that all of you should go and check out St. Gregory Palamas. If this in some way introduced you to the text, I'm very thankful for it. Go and check out an Orthodox church or any church at all. Get back in touch with your own church. And I hope you have fun doing apologetics. And even if you are someone who is a detractor from Christianity, I hope you'll think about what was said here. And, God bless you. God bless all of you. Have a really splendid day.